Good morning, everybody. It's Tuesday, isn't it? All day. Welcome to Pen Vicarage. Lovely to see you wherever you're watching. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you find our reading this morning helpful today. Friends, we are working our way through the letter to the Hebrews. We're approaching kind of towards the back end of it now. This fascinating book, as I said, we don't know who's written to, we don't know who's written by or when, for that matter. But nonetheless, I'll tell you, it's rammed full of good stuff, isn't it? And so we're in chapter 11 today. I'm going to read you verses 17 to 10. Quite a long reading this morning. Bear with me. It's a good read as well. But anyway, I'll explain it to you afterwards. I'll try to. Hebrews chapter 11, starting to read at verse 17. By faith, Abraham, who when put to the test, offered up Isaac. He who'd received the promises was ready to offer up his only son, of whom he had been told, it's through Isaac that the descendants shall be named for you. He considered the fact that God is even able to raise someone from the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. By faith, Isaac invoked blessings for the future on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave instructions about his burial. By faith, Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking for a head to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, unafraid of the king's anger, for he persevered as though he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as it were on a dry land, but when the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after they'd been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she'd received the spies in peace. And what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David, Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death, they were sawn in two, they were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in caves and holes in the ground. Yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, right in the middle of this Hebrews is all about people who are having a hard time for the faith, and he's encouraging them because God is great and because Jesus is great to keep the faith. In chapter 11, he gives us this extra sort of interjection, you might say, all about faith. And so again and again and again, he says, by faith, so-and-so did something, okay? And he gives you this kind of heroes gallery of great Old Testament heroes who, through faith, God did amazing things. And it's, as I say, it's like a heroes gallery. It's like I don't know, if you go to the golf club, you see all these kind of pictures of old golfers who did brilliantly in the past. Or, if you go to the House of Commons, you've got all these great prime ministers and statues and everything else. And here you've got this kind of list of heroes of the faith who, through faith, God did amazing things. But I want to say a couple of things about these people, really. Well, 3 things, in fact. Firstly, they all started small, okay? So, for example, Moses was basically, as a baby, he escaped genocide. Who else have we got? We've got Samson, who, despite what pictures would tell you, was actually a puny little man who God gave strength to. We know that because when he lost his hair, he lost his strength. And if he'd had muscles, he would have, wouldn't he? You've got Gideon, and I think this is really funny. The Bible describes him as being the puniest man from the puniest family and the puniest tribe and the, whatever. And all of a sudden he's sitting there one day and someone comes up to him and says, "Hail, great and mighty warrior." Imagine he would go, sort of, what? That's the other fella. It's kind of like that. He picks incredibly small people. And so I could go on and on and on. David began as the smallest son, as a shepherd boy. So they all kind of started really small. These people weren't born into power, so to speak. They all kind of began small. What I'm trying to say is the first thing is that they were actually, they were small, they were weak, they were young, they started from a place of weakness. That's the first thing. The second thing to say about these people is they were all flawed characters as well. They all messed up. David, of course, committed adultery. Who else have we got? Samson was a victim of temptation by his then wife. Who else have we got? Moses murdered an Egyptian guard 40 years too soon and struck the rock when he was only supposed to talk to it. Various other people. And Jephthah, of course, made an incredibly rash promise with an incredibly sad result in the end. David committed adultery. Rahab was a prostitute. These were all decidedly flawed characters from beginning to end. And yet, God did great things through them. And actually, we are all flawed characters as well. So it tells us something that God can use us. So, before we look at the great achievements, first that these people all started small, okay? They started small. They started either as children or whatever. And yet God did great things with them. And I suppose in a sense, we are starting small, don't we? But in our weakness, God is strong. There used to be a Christian song, I didn't like the song very much actually, but it used to say, "He turns our weaknesses into his opportunities, so the glory goes to him," as the song used to say. And so here you've got a whole series of people. These are great heroes of faith, but the Bible is very clear that they all kind of started small. That these weren't sort of, born into greatness. They all started small and God did great things with them. Also, like I said, they were decidedly flawed characters. They made mistakes. They gaffed up. Sometimes big style with enormous results. Sometimes they got it horribly, horribly wrong. So they weren't kind of plaster saints who were kind of, butter wouldn't melt in their mouths. And actually, they got it wrong. And actually, so did all the great heroes of the Bible, except Jesus, of course. The disciples were a decidedly flawed bunch as well. If you look at them, Jesus had an interesting kind of recruitment campaign, really. His selection criteria were quite interesting. They were decidedly flawed characters. And actually, in a sense, they messed up, but actually God made them right. And it's by their faith that they were made righteous. So in a sense, when we foul up too, it's faith which is counted to us as righteousness. And these people here, they were flawed characters as well, and yet God kind of made them righteous too. And yet, as the writer of Hebrews says, despite the fact they started small, despite the fact they were flawed characters, despite all that, actually through faith, God did incredible things. And they'll talk at the end about some of the incredible steadfastness that they had, the great things that they conquered, kingdoms that they conquered, promises they obtained, escaping mouths of lions. They did some incredible things, and they demonstrated incredible resilience, because they may have been weak, they may have been flawed characters, but through faith, and through faith alone, God did amazing things. So I suppose what I'm saying to us is, despite the fact that we're weak, and despite our flawed characters, God can and does do amazing things through us. But in the middle of the Hebrew, in the middle of this, there is a bit of a sideswipe as well at the people the writer of Hebrews is writing to. Because remember I said earlier on that the writer of the Hebrews is writing to people who are having a hard time, and yet and he's encouraging them to keep the faith. Because he's talking about Moses in verse 26, and he says, he considered abuse suffered for Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. He was looking forward to the reward. Now, Moses, of course, lived 1,000 years before Christ, which makes that quite an interesting thing to say. But of course, we all know that it's Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, forever. It's one God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, same God. Of course, it is. But I think what the writer to the Hebrews is saying here to the hearers is, he considered abuse to be taken for the faith, if you like, to be more important than, the promises of God were more important than the wealth of Egypt. And so what he's saying to the people he's writing to here is, in the same way, the treasures in Jesus are much greater than the persecution, the hard time you may be having it. So you may be having a hard time, but hang on in there, because God is good and the promises of God are so much greater. So, fascinating chapter this, blooming good read. I mean, it really is, isn't it, really? You've got here the great heroes of the faith, but remember, they started small, like we do, that they were flawed characters, like we are, and yet God did do incredible things through them, and God can and does through us today. But in the middle of it, the writer writes to the Hebrews, the people he's writing to, if Moses can do it, then you can. But remember, however tough time you may be having, the promises of God are greater, and there's so much more to look forward to. Have a lovely day. God bless you. Thanks for being here today. Don't forget to share the messages just